Everybody, and welcome to the TNT lesson for this week online. I'm glad that you've joined me. I hope that you had a great week this past week, and even though the weather wasn't quite as warm as it was a couple weeks back, which may not happen again for a little while, it was still pretty nice. Hopefully you got to get outside and enjoy being outside. Some of you may have started up spring sports, soccer or baseball or softball or something like that. So those are definitely fun to be able to do and to be able to get outside and enjoy God's creation and have some fun playing a sport. So this week we're looking at section 4.2 in our TNT book. And as you can see on the screen here, and maybe you've even worked through the section already, it talks about grace and law. Okay, so I want to start out by asking you a question. Now, if mom or dad or somebody else is sitting there with you, don't look at them right away, okay, if they're a driver, okay? This is not to criticize anybody's driving abilities, all right? But I want to ask, what are some rules that you can think of that a driver, somebody that has their license, might have to obey? Can you think of any? A lot of times you can think about the signs that you see on the side of the road, because a lot of times those signs are either helping the drivers to know where to go, or they're telling them rules about how they need to be driving on the road. So maybe you came up with things like the speed limit. That's a big one, right? Being able to stay under the speed limit. That's one. You can think of stop signs. You have to stop at stop signs. Stop lights would be this sort of the same idea, right? Some other things you might think of are things like not texting while you drive, not looking at your phone, maybe wearing a seatbelt. Maybe you thought of slowing down when there's construction or road construction happening. All great things, right? What happens? Or let me ask it this way. Have you ever seen any driver ever break any of those rules? Which ones, if you've seen them? Now, again, don't point the finger at who did it if they're in the room. Just, I want you to think out loud with me. You can talk to the screen while you're watching, or you can just think of the answer in your head. Now, what would happen if an adult that has their driver's license, which is what you need in order to be able to drive on the road, what would happen if an adult was only allowed to keep that license if they followed every single rule all of the time? Do you think we'd have a lot of drivers on the road, or do you think we'd have less than we do now? Right, we'd probably have less, because that's really hard to do, right? Really hard to keep all of those rules. There's a lot of laws, you can call them laws and rules for the road. And so sometimes it's hard to remember them. Sometimes we're in a rush. Sometimes we just choose not to follow them. All different things. Now, just like there's a lot of rules on the road, there's a lot of rules in the Old Testament in the Bible that God gave his people, the nation of Israel. Okay, he gave them so many rules, but the reason he gave them these laws and these rules, there's a couple reasons, but one of the reasons was to help the other people that lived outside of that nation understand that God was different, that God's rules, God's ways were different than their ways. Okay, so that was one of the reasons, but it also was to help them understand that they can't keep all the rules, which we've talked about to some extent already. But the problem is that it was impossible for the Israelites to keep them all. All right? And so they needed to understand that, and they needed to see that. Now, it's a little bit different with driving, because you can keep all the rules when you're driving. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't keep the rules when you're driving on the road, but we have to understand that there's a lot of them. In the Old Testament, actually, and the Bible shows us that by the time we get to the New Testament, there were about 600 different laws that the people had that they were following if they were an Israelite. And so that's a lot. That's hard stuff, okay? And that's why in order to be able to keep all the law, that means you're living a life that's righteous, that's following all the rules, that you're doing the right thing. But the Bible shows us, and what we're looking at today is this idea that there's a thing called grace, which we've talked about already. But God gives us this gift, even though we aren't following all the rules, even though we might be trying, we aren't able to follow all the rules perfectly. God still chose to send Jesus Christ. God still chose to give us a relationship with Him through Jesus. All right, and that's really what your section is talking about today. So let's look at your book. There's really not a ton in it this week overall. It starts on page 196 is over here, and then page 197 is over here. Those are the two pages that we'll do. I'm actually going to skip my first slide because we kind of just talked about it. So the first section, or our section verse for this week, comes from Galatians 3:11. All right, there it is on the screen. Galatians 3:11 says, "Clearly no one is justified before God by the law, because the righteous will live by faith." So again, let's understand those words in there. The word law is really talking about the idea of rules. Okay, and the Old Testament had the law in it. It had the rules that they were following, or that they were supposed to be following. Okay, the J word there, justified, and these answers, these definitions are in your book on page 197 towards the bottom. There it says to be judged by God as innocent and righteous. Okay, so we are justified, we are declared righteous by God, and how? Because the righteous will live by faith. So that means that if we're living righteously, even though we can't keep all the rules, we can have faith, and that faith allows God, well, I don't want to skip ahead, but basically, we are declared righteous because as we have faith, Jesus came and Jesus lived he kept all those rules. He lived a perfect life. He never sinned. So the Bible tells us that His righteousness is what God sees when He looks at us if we've placed our faith in Him. So even though we can't be completely righteous in and of ourselves, we can have faith in Jesus Christ, who was completely righteous in the way that He lived His life here on earth. So our book says there, it's got a blank there about halfway down the page on 196. Based on Galatians 3:11, our verse here, it says, Paul is the one writing here. He says that the blank shall live by faith. The blank shall live by faith. And so the answer there is the righteous, the one that's living a life that's characterized by doing the right thing. Your book defines it as perfectly good, always doing what God says is right. Okay? The next passage that it has there also on page 196 is James chapter 2, verse 10. And I'm going to read that for us. Our question based on this verse is, what does this verse say about breaking just one law? Verse 10 says, "For whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles at just one point is guilty of breaking all of it." So what does that say about breaking just one law? It says that it's just like you did what? If you break one, you're guilty of breaking them all. So it doesn't matter whether you did just a teeny little sin or whether you did a really big sin. In God's eyes, you're guilty. It doesn't matter if it was 1 or 2 or 50 or 100. And again, we've talked before, and we will talk a little bit more with this idea of grace, that that doesn't mean that we should sin as much as we can because we're guilty anyway. Because what Jesus Christ did should make a difference. It should impact the way that we live our lives. And so we need to make sure that we are seeking to live righteously, even though we understand we're not perfect, but Jesus Christ was. All right? So then on the top of page 197, the last question that we have for today in our section is, what does this verse, Philippians 3:9, say about the idea of righteousness? So let me read Philippians chapter 3, verse 9. "Being found in Him, not having a righteousness of my own that comes from the law, but that which comes is through faith in Christ. The righteousness that comes from God is by faith." So it's a sort of an odd way to say it, but we can break that down a little bit. My answer here on the screen is a little long. But basically, this verse is saying that I can't be righteous on my own. That's what he's saying there when he says, not having a righteousness of my own that comes from the law. That means I can't earn it. I can't keep the law perfectly. Therefore, I'm not righteous. I'm guilty. So the only way that I can be righteous is through faith in Christ. And that statement of the righteousness that comes from God is by faith. The way that we are declared righteous and justified to God is because of our faith in Jesus Christ, who lived a completely righteous life. And that's basically what the answer is there up on the screen. All right, so a lot in there this week, a lot to talk about, but this idea of grace and law, we have to understand it, because if we go along living our lives thinking that if we keep all the rules, we're going to make it to heaven, we're missing out. We're missing out on the most important piece of what Jesus came to do. And he came to fulfill the law. He told us that in Matthew 5. He says, I came to fulfill the law, not to get rid of it, but to fulfill it. So he came to follow it perfectly, so that way when we place our faith in him, God looks at the righteousness of Jesus and sees that, and not necessarily my guilt. And so therefore I become justified in God's eyes. So a lot of big concepts, but a lot of really important things to think about. Thanks for watching, and I hope that you'll consider this week the idea of God's grace and all that he's done for us. And you can be thankful for how he sent Jesus to live the perfect, righteous life, so that way we can be justified because of our faith in him and not have to try to earn it. Because if we earn it, or if we try to earn it, we're not going to get there. We're not going to be perfect. And so we're thankful for the grace of God and Jesus Christ, life, death, and resurrection. So thanks for watching. I hope you have a great week, and we will see you next week, hopefully. Bye.